tremendous technical, very complicated issues, and they've been raised multiple times in the record. I want to start by talking a little bit about the record of proceedings that is before you as decision makers today. And I understand that there are resolutions that the board has passed in the past governing the way that they conduct appeal hearings of various types of decisions that are made by the Planning Commission. And those are helpful in guiding us through this process. But for the CEQA record of proceedings that is before you as the ultimate decision-making body for the county, that record of proceedings is vast. And it begins kind of at the time that the project kind of becomes a gleam in the eye of the folks in the planning department and the people who are bringing that proposal forward. There's a fair bit of case law speaking to this issue, and there is a Public Resources Code section 21167.6E, if you're interested, that defines the record of proceedings. And that includes any document that is related to the project or related to CEQA compliance. So there is not a limited record before you today as you make your decision. In situations where the Planning Commission has, issued a permit or denied a permit, it may be that, the county's procedures for review at this level would define a body of evidence. But today, that body of evidence is defined by the Public Resources Code. And it is up to you as the ultimate decision makers to make that decision on the certification of the EIR and the approval of the project. So I just wanted to be, really clear about how broad this is, and it's really all the information that's been submitted to the agency up to this point. So with that behind us, I actually appreciated the fact that there was a little bit of discussion in the staff report about, what are we doing when we comply with CEQA? It is an informational process. That's the whole point of it, is to get all of the information out about what the potential impacts are, and then what the potential mitigation measures are and alternatives, and make a really good decision. I mean, that's the point, right? You go through that whole process so that you can make excellent decisions. And the whole analysis is based upon an accurate, stable, finite project description. In this particular case, and this has been a challenge that I would not have welcomed if I were in staff's shoes, what is the project description here? I think this is a very significant question, and I think there's an overarching flaw in this CEQA document that needs to be addressed before this moves forward. The county has consistently asserted that it has no authority over the bottling facility or its activities because of the zoning. And that the only thing the county is approving here is the caretaker's residence. Well, if that's true, then I don't think the county's the lead agency, first of all, simply because they're the first one to issue an approval in this situation doesn't make them the lead agency. There are factors that are considered, and sometimes when there's confusion about, who is the lead agency, the agencies that, potentially could be playing that role will get together and determine who should act as the lead agency and who, would be in the responsible agency roles. In this particular case, I don't know. I wasn't, in the room when these decisions were made, why the county ended up being the one to prepare the EIR in this case. The difficulties that arise because of this situation of the county having this very limited authority are significant, and they really undermine the analysis. The project description assumes many, many things, and maybe the most fundamental of them is an assumption about what the levels of production will be. Those levels of production that'll directly impact the extraction rate. And so we've got all kinds of analysis, and we have a lot of good people with a lot of knowledge working on these questions. You know, what will the impacts be to the groundwater, et cetera? All of that's based upon a very specific assumption about what the extraction rate is going to be. The county has repeatedly in the environmental document and throughout the staff report said we have no authority to limit the extraction rate. So how did we come up with this project description that says, well, it'll be X number of gallons per year, that's, you know, or per day or whatever it is? How did we come to that conclusion if there's no authority to limit? There's no cap on the level of extraction. Now, that's something that can be reached by agreement between the county and the applicant. And that's the other thing, to say, well, this will all be handled in conditions of approval. Well, to the extent that the condition of approval isn't directly tied to the caretaker's residence, the county has no enforcement authority. The 1998 agreement becomes a condition of approval for the caretaker's residence. How is that going to get enforced in the future? You say, well, we're going to revoke your permit for the caretaker's residence. Okay. It's barely habitable anyway because the health risks are so significant to whoever is going to end up there. This is a real, and I realize it's a conundrum, and I understand that it's a challenge that, like I said, a lot of good people have done a lot of good work, and I think it can be something that could result in an environmental impact report that could be applicable to this project. But right now, there's not a finite project description because the county, you're basically just saying they've indicated what they're planning to do, and we're just going to assume that that will happen. We have no authority or ability to bind them to that, but we'll just assume that that's going to happen. I don't think that meets the standard that's required by CEQA to have if you're going to certify the EIR for this project, what you're also doing is looking at it and saying, this is an informational document that meets the standard that's required by CEQA. We're providing the public with the information about the level of production that's going to be allowed there. When in fact, what you're doing is saying, we're going to issue a permit for the caretaker's residence, and we've been informed that these are the activities that are going to occur at the bottling plant, but we don't have authority over that. So we can't guarantee that that's actually what it's going to look like in the long term. There's just a few more steps that need to happen in this situation in order for this environmental document to pass muster. And there are options. You know, and one of the things that we suggested was issue a permit for the whole of the project, right? Because then you do have conditions of approval. If we were in a situation, and I'll speak to the zoning in a few minutes, if we were in a situation where the county could issue a permit for the bottling facility itself, then of course you could include all of these mitigation measures as conditions of approval, and they would be enforceable, and they would be consistent with what's required by the law. The other option is to enter into an agreement, which again, I was not here in 1998, but you know, maybe that's the way the 1998 agreement came about. You have a situation where you're going to authorize certain activities there. You do have to look at the whole of the project. You do have to think about the community, right? As the decision makers for the county, the residents, particularly in this case, the residents who are very nearby. You know, there's certain things that have to take place, and certain assurances, and probably how you ended up with the 1998 agreement to begin with. I don't know though. But an agreement is an option. It is a way of making your mitigation measures enforceable. And if they're not enforceable, they don't meet the standards that are required by the Public Resources Code. They have to be enforceable through a permit condition or through an agreement or some other legally binding way of enforcing those mitigation measures. And at the moment, that just hasn't happened. And like I said, I believe that there's a way to get to that place. I just don't think that it's there yet. Right now, the project description is a hopeful description of what the applicant has represented will likely happen there. But there's no way of binding them to that level of operation, or even the specifics about where the truck, you know, for example, the truck route. By agreement, the trucks will not, you know, roll through the city of Mount Shasta. What happens if that doesn't occur? what is the enforcement mechanism? Right now, the county does not have the ability to enforce the mitigation measures. So they're hopeful, but they're not binding. So in the memorandum that was a response to the appeal document, there was some discussion about, it kind of in responding to this this issue. One of the items was that the mitigation measures would be conditions of approval. And like I said, that sounds good if you're issuing a permit for the bottling facility, but you're not. What you're doing is you're issuing a permit for a very small, it's really very small piece of what's going to occur on this project site. It's a caretaker's residence that, as far as I can tell, they don't even necessarily need. And it really is not going to be as useful as it could be if the health risk assessment hadn't revealed the danger there. So, I mean, it is really such a small piece. Again, it raises in my mind the question of why the county is the lead agency to begin with. And I don't know how that came about. And it can be resolved. It just there just has to be a few more steps in between. In the staff response, they indicated that there would be conditions of approval, and that also much of the mitigation would be taking place at the hands of the responsible agencies. And without going, deeply into, a lot of citations, deferring mitigation and the development of mitigation measures to the future in and of itself is something that just is not allowed under CEQA. There are very specific times when mitigation measures can be deferred to the future, and it has to be coupled with not only a commitment to mitigate the impact, but standards of performance and options for mitigating, et cetera. In this case, you simply have a situation, and in some ways it's understandable. Those responsible agencies are the ones who are going to have the real enforcement authority here. But you can't just defer to the responsible agencies and say, well, we're going to let them worry about this, right? We're going to let them look at the impacts to air quality when those air permits are issued. We're going to let the city worry about, their waste discharge requirements and that sort of thing. Really, it's just not something that's possible under CEQA. And the CEQA guidelines 15097 really kind of starts that whole conversation, and there's case law on top of it. But it says you can delegate reporting, you can delegate monitoring, you can delegate all kinds of things to responsible agencies. But the lead agency, when it certifies the document and approves the project, is 100% responsible for the enforceability of those mitigation measures. And right now, there just isn't, the county just doesn't have the mechanism for being able to say these are enforceable. They will be at some point when those other agencies issue their permits, but there will be this, there's just a gap there that isn't appropriate. So there was some discussion about, very brief discussion in the staff report about the wastewater treatment options. And so there are 3 options that were included in the environmental document and reviewed. There were multiple places in the document and throughout the process where it was indicated very explicitly that one of the wastewater treatment options would be chosen prior to approval of the project and certification of the EIR. It has been, in response to the appeal, staff has indicated that that is not the case, that the project will be approved and that it will be up to the applicant later to choose one of those wastewater treatment options. There are, as you might imagine, in my view, a lot of problems with making that representation at the beginning and then at this very late stage in the process saying, no, we're going to just leave all 3 options open to the applicant in the future. I do think that triggers a need to, at the very least, recirculate the document so that the folks who have commented and have concerns about wastewater treatment impacts can understand that by approving this, you are actually approving all three options. So all of the impacts associated with all three of those options are something that you're having to look at and say, we have sufficient mitigation measures in place, enforceable mitigation measures in place right now, so that we can certify this document and say, yes, those impacts of each and every one of those three wastewater treatment options will be mitigated to a level of insignificance. That's a difficult task in light of what I was just talking about, that it's the responsible agencies that are going to have the enforcement authority over that, not the county. So it's a difficult task for you to say, yes, all of the mitigation measures that would render the impacts of each and every one of those three options to a level of insignificance are enforceable today. Because we're just not there yet. So I do think that as a result of that change, and so that those who have submitted comments on the wastewater treatment options, so that they understand that all three are going to be part of the approval, I think that that requires a recirculation, at least for that portion of the document, so that you can get additional input on that issue. Turning to the AB 52 analysis, again, much of that has happened in closed session and as confidential communications between the tribe and the county. It is our view that the consultation was terminated not for the reasons that are, AB 52 allows for a situation where consultation can proceed, and the tribal cultural resources can be identified, impacts can be analyzed, mitigation measures can be discussed. All of those things happen, and it is true that at some point in the process, if there is an impasse that is reached and the parties just can't agree, either on the identification of a resource or whatever it is, if there is an inability to agree, then the process can be terminated. In this case, it is my view that the process was terminated because it had taken a long time. And that's really not a basis for terminating the consultation. It is the tribal cultural resources. There's really one set of people who are experts on the value of that resource and what would be a significant impact to it. And if they do not have a full opportunity to weigh in on the level of significance of the impacts to those resources that have been identified, then the consultation process is continuing. If they have identified them, they've determined the level of significance, and they can't agree on a mitigation measure or whatever the case may be, then it doesn't have to go on indefinitely. But this particular consultation was not complete, in my view. And I do think that the CEQA document also doesn't reflect, it does say that, this is actually in the CEQA findings, that no known tribal cultural resources were identified in the study area. And that's just, I don't know if it was an artifact from another document or something, but it's not true, because they were identified. And that was something that was accepted by both the tribe and the county during the consultation process. So there are tribal cultural resources, and I do think that the consultation should be continuing at this moment. So I talked a little bit already about the project description. I don't want to get too far into the weeds about all the small details, but there are a lot of comments in the record about the assumptions that were made about what the level of production will be based upon operations at other plants and that sort of thing, and all of those things are again overshadowed by the problem of the county acknowledging that they don't have any authority over what happens there in terms of production levels. So if you don't have any authority over the production levels, and you're trying to create a project description, you really have a problem. Without having a binding legal agreement with the applicant, you can't really say what that's going to be. I mean, the way that I would describe this right now, if I had to write an EIR for it, would be I would describe very clearly the caretaker's residence, and then I would say that there will be bottling activities adjacent. That's really all the county can say right now. You might be able to enforce the 1998 agreement without additional written commitment from this applicant, but probably not. So there's very little that the county has any control over right now. So you're in a position where you're being asked to certify an environmental document for a project that's been very specifically described, but is also something that isn't binding. So it's a problem that I've been thinking about since I initially started working on this question of how do you enforce the mitigation measures, and I haven't come to a conclusion about how that would be possible. You really do have to do, and staff is right, you've got to wait until the responsible agencies get involved. So to certify the document now and say that it's all enforceable and that this project description is binding is premature. As far as the project objectives are concerned, I mean, I'm sure that, and this has been something that's been commented, the comments were submitted on the draft EIR, on the final EIR, so it's kind of gone back and forth between, public comments and staff. There's a specific aspect of it, though, that I think is concerning, and it also gets to some of the questions that were raised earlier. Greenhouse gas emissions are a concern. And it's easy. Well, it's not easy. It's hard. It's a really difficult area. And part of it is because it's a global problem. And, I mean, you can start to look at it here's our project right here. Well, how are we going to, first of all, how are we really, we're one drop in the bucket, right? Are we really having a significant impact? And then, from the other direction, what is it that we can do? Can we really, make a positive impact on it? Well, that's, so you have these state guidelines, you have these goals, you have all of these things. It's very easy to get to a point where you say, well, no matter what we do, we're going to have a significant and unavoidable impact. So we'll get some offset credits and say that's all we can do. And really, what CEQA requires, once a finding has been made of a significant and unavoidable impact, the agency still has an obligation to look at feasible mitigation measures, even though they won't avoid the impact entirely. If you can reduce that impact, you've got to look at that. And if it's feasible, you've got to adopt it. And so one of the alternatives that was dismissed relatively early, or it wasn't analyzed in depth, was the alternative that would allow the plant to come online after the Lassen substation was completed. So you don't have these generators, right? So there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions coming from generators. So that alternative was considered not to meet the project objectives, mostly because there was this sense of urgency that the plant needs to get online because there's this market demand and it has to happen right away. And I don't think there's any evidence in the record to support the notion that it has to happen before that electrical source is available. And this is where, when you're, it seems like a straightforward exercise to say, well, what are our project objectives? We write them down, right? There they are. We want to do this right away. Well, of course. When you're a project proponent, you want to get going. You want to get it started. And I understand that. But to include that in a CEQA document as a project objective and then potentially reject mitigation measures or alternatives that would otherwise be feasible based upon the notion that there's this urgency, I think you really need to look and say, do we have substantial evidence to support the idea that this is so urgent that we can't consider this alternative that would avoid what is our one and only significant and unavoidable impact, or at least reduce it. And I think there's an obligation there, and I think that that to, and maybe there is some evidence that this really is urgent and it has to happen right away. I just don't, it's not in the record now, at least not that I've been able to find. And so for you as decision makers, you know, to look at this and say, is it really urgent? You know, what am I basing my conclusion on when I make that decision? I think at the moment there needs to be more in the record to support a conclusion that it is so urgent that these potentially feasible alternatives or mitigation measures are, well, those aren't feasible, right, because it won't meet our project objective. I think that's just something that needs to be worked on. I almost hesitate to dive into the individual areas of impact, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. And again, there is a very large CEQA record of proceedings right now. I'm sure you are aware of this. Even just the box that came for this appeal, it's a lot of documentation. It's a lot of information. And I do, again, want to commend staff, and they have done a great job of, you know, distilling this for you and making these presentations. And then I'm over here, you know, distilling it in a way that makes sense to me. I think as you think about these things, though, to the extent that there are, and I'm about to talk to you a little bit about the areas where I think there's additional work that needs to be done. This has been a long process, and I know a lot of times going through a CEQA process, there's almost a feeling like, well, can't we just have this be over? You know, everyone's worked hard. There's a lot of information that's come to light. Let's just, you know, make a decision and be done with it. I think in this case, because of some of the reasons that I talked about just a few minutes ago, and also because of some of these areas of impact where I think some additional analysis and study just really needs to happen, I do think that that's something for you to consider as decision makers. You know, do I feel like I have all the information that I need to come to these conclusions? With respect to the impacts to aesthetics, I won't go into, you know, too much of the technical detail, but there was some reliance on the 1998 agreement. Just highlighting again that problem of enforceability. How do you enforce the 1998 agreement at this moment? It's unclear. I also want to point out, you know, there is kind of an assumption, you know, when it pops up as a bullet point, oh, 1998 agreement mitigation measures will be enforced on this project. Well, not all of them. And if you look at the documentation, it's a selective sum of the mitigation measures in the 1998 agreement will be followed. And with respect to aesthetics, some of the 1998 mitigation requirements weren't followed, and now that's considered kind of the baseline condition, and that's why there aren't going to be any mitigation measures additionally to the existing structures. Nothing will be required there, like in terms of an earth tone or something like that, because, well, this is part of the baseline condition. Again, I think this is an area where the enforceability of the 1998 agreement, whether or not you can add mitigation measures in addition to that, given the county's acknowledgement that it doesn't have any authority over the bottling facility, it creates a lot of difficulty in making conclusions that there's a less than significant aesthetic impact. And I think that's an area that needs to have some work. The air quality impacts, there is extensive comment in the record. I submitted a lengthy comment letter. We also had a comment from Greg Gilbert, who is an air quality expert. And, you know, when the draft EIR came out, there was an emissions analysis there that, and I'm going to ask in a moment if maybe I can have our expert come up and just take a few minutes and respond to what we heard today, which that's new for us, the health risk assessment information. I would like for him to be able to respond to that and maybe just address very briefly some of these things that are a little more technical than probably what I'm qualified to deliver to you. But I'll just start by saying that there was a manipulation of the, you know, there's a fleet mix that is, you know, general light industrial there are standards that air quality experts use. Well, this is the use, this is the fleet mix, and then we model from there. And in the draft EIR, there was really a very heavy manipulation of the fleet mix without an explanation for why certain types of vehicles were just being pulled out of that mix. And it resulted in a very favorable conclusion about what the air quality impacts are going to be, assuming that the level of production remains what is in the project description at the moment. And in response to a lot of comments that were received about this problem of you can't just modify the fleet mix and not really explain it and end up with this extraordinarily favorable conclusion about air quality impacts, there was a revision and some additional work done, and in the final EIR, it was just a different manipulation of the fleet mix. Again, rather than using that standard mix and modeling from there, or if there is a modification to those standard assumptions, providing a real explanation for why why it's supported, to remove a particular vehicle type or whatever it is. It was just a different type of manipulation. It resulted in a significant increase in the estimated emissions in the final EIR. In fact, for greenhouse gas emissions, it nearly doubled, or I think it did double. In my view, this is an area where you have kind of a layered challenge. One is the challenge of how do you hold the applicant to the level of production and therefore the traffic counts that are in the environmental impact report. If the county doesn't have the authority to regulate that or to control it or enforce it in any way, that could change in the future. So you're coming to some conclusions based upon the modeling that is based upon an assumption about what the levels of production will be.